Warm welcome, dear audience. What's time there, and where are you watching this story from? Tonight, we step into an age of shadows and whispers, where disease moved like an unseen spirit through the villages and cities of medieval Europe. There were no hospitals as we know them, no doctors with white coats, no microscopes revealing the crawling world of germs. To the medieval people, illness was not just a physical ailment, it was a punishment, a curse, or a divine test of the soul. When fever burned through the body or cough rattled the lungs, people did not reach for medicine, they reached for faith, fire, and superstition. The story begins in a small village nestled beneath a grey sky. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and smoke, and within every thatched house, prayers murmured louder than any doctor's advice. A child coughed blood into a rag, and his mother, with trembling hands, whispered that perhaps the angels were testing her. The village healer, an old woman named Elwyn, was called not because she had medicine, but because she had wisdom passed from mothers before her. She entered carrying a pouch of dried herbs, a small knife, and a book of holy symbols. To her, disease was a living thing, a shadow that could be lured, frightened, or starved. Elwyn began by burning rosemary and sage, letting the smoke fill the room. The air carries demons, she said softly, waving her hand to drive them out. The villagers believed her, for in those days, air itself was thought to rot, and the foul smells of sickness were seen as the breath of evil. She rubbed the child's chest with vinegar and salt, muttering charms in a language no one else remembered. If the fever broke, they said it was the herbs. If it did not, they said it was God's will. Beyond the villages, monasteries became the silent guardians of healing. Monks and nuns copied ancient texts from Greece and Rome, but their remedies were often prayers written beside recipes for potions of wine and crushed wormwood. A monk named Brother Eamon kept a small garden where each plant had both a name and a spirit. He brewed mixtures not for science but for faith, believing each herb carried divine energy. When the sick came to his gates, he offered bread soaked in honey and whispered psalms over their foreheads. Some healed, some did not, but every recovery was a miracle in their eyes. In castles, the rich had their own cures, baths in milk, leeches to drain the bad humours, and perfumes to ward off miasma. Physicians spoke of for humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If any of these fell out of balance, the body would sicken. To restore harmony, they bled the patient with knives, purged the stomach with bitter drinks, or forced sweat through hot stones. Pain was not feared, it was believed to be cleansing. A nobleman might lose a pint of blood and call it healing. A poor farmer might lose his life and call it fate. But among the common folk, medicine was older than any book. They trusted the earth, the moon, and their grandmothers. A woman with a fever would be laid under a full moon, wrapped in cold linen, soaked in river water. Men struck by mad spirits were made to drink water poured through the skull of a hanged man. For toothaches, a mouse roasted over a fire was pressed to the cheek. For plague, garlic hung at every door, and charms carved with crosses dangled from necks. It was a world of desperate creativity, and yet, sometimes, it worked. Because hidden beneath the superstition, nature's wisdom still whispered. Honey cleansed wounds, vinegar killed some infections, and garlic truly fought decay. They did not know why, but they knew that it did. Every healer was both scientist and sorcerer, blending ritual with instinct. Elwyn once treated a man dying of infection by applying mouldy bread to his wound. The villagers called it witchcraft. Centuries later, we would call it penicillin. Still, fear was stronger than knowledge. When sickness swept through villages, fevers, plagues, the sweating sickness, people fled from each other. They buried their dead in silence and turned to the church for answers. Priests spoke of sin and purification. Candles burned day and night in hopes of divine mercy. Some believed the stars, controlled health, and when Saturn aligned with Mars, they hid indoors. Others walked barefoot, through the mud to holy wells, drinking the water that saints had once blessed. For many, illness became a path to holiness. To suffer was to share Christ's pain. To purify the soul, the sick were blessed, feared, and pitied all at once. And when the body failed, people said the spirit was simply being called home. But in every village, there were those, like Elwyn, who refused to surrender. They searched the woods for herbs, spoke to the wind, and watched how animals healed themselves. From these quiet observers, the first true medicine would one day be born. The night after the child's fever broke, Elwyn sat by the fire, her wrinkled hands shaking with exhaustion. She looked at the stars and whispered, "It was never me, it was the earth." For in her heart, she knew that healing was not magic, nor entirely divine. It was something living, buried deep in the soil and in the courage of those who refused to give up. As the bells of midnight tolled from the monastery on the hill, another child coughed in another village, another mother prayed, another healer prepared her herbs, and so the cycle continued. A world treating pain without medicine, guided by faith, fire, and the fragile hope that tomorrow the fever might fade. The dawn rose gently over the monastery walls, painting the stone towers gold. Bells echoed across the valley, calling monks from their wooden beds to prayer. This was not a world of bustling hospitals or sterile rooms. It was a place where healing began, with faith, silence, and scripture. Inside the monastery of St. Havel, rows of robed figures knelt before flickering candles, whispering Latin prayers for the sick and the dying beyond their gates. For these monks, disease was not just a wound of flesh, it was a wound of the soul. Brother Eamon, the monastery's healer, rose from prayer with weary eyes. His fingers were stained green from the herbs he had crushed through the night. On his table lay scrolls filled with careful handwriting, recipes, remedies, and fragments copied from forgotten Greek physicians. In all things he murmured, "God hides wisdom." He believed that nature was God's second scripture, written not in ink, but in roots, flowers, and stones. Each leaf carried a verse, each plant a divine intention. The infirmary of St. Havel was small. 6 wooden beds lined the walls, each draped with rough blankets. The air smelled of beeswax, vinegar, and thyme. Patients came from nearby villages. Peasants with fevers, soldiers with festering wounds, mothers clutching infants too weak to cry. Brother Eamon tended to them all. He moved slowly, speaking softly, pressing poultices made from honey and herbs onto open sores. His tools were not iron and glass, but faith and earth. A young novice, Brother Lucien, watched him work. "Father," he asked, "how do herbs cure the sick if only God gives life?" Eamon smiled faintly. "The herbs do not cure," he said. "They obey. As we obey God, so to do they. Healing comes when faith and nature walk together." It was a philosophy both humble and revolutionary, one that saw no separation between the sacred and the scientific long before science itself was born. When disease spread, the monastery became both refuge and tomb. During plagues, the monks carried the dead on wooden carts, singing hymns through veils soaked in vinegar to protect against the foul air. They believed disease traveled through smells. The miasma and that sweet scent could drive it away. So they burned rosemary, lavender, and pine, filling the air with smoke until their eyes watered. Some died despite their efforts, others miraculously survived. The survivors called it divine mercy. Eamon kept a secret journal, hidden behind a wooden cross on his shelf. Within its pages were years of quiet observation. He noticed that those who washed off and survived, more fevers, that wounds cleaned with wine healed faster, and that certain plants calmed pain better than prayer alone. Yet he dared not speak of such things openly, for to claim nature could rival faith was dangerous. Many had been branded heretics for less. One winter, a young woman named Alara arrived at the monastery gates. She carried her brother on her back, his skin pale as snow, his breathing shallow. "Please," she begged, "he has the death cough." Brother Eamon lifted the boy gently onto a bed. The others crossed themselves. The cough was feared, for it came swiftly and killed cruelly. Eamon brewed a mixture of honey, vinegar, and crushed garlic, pressing it to the boy's lips. Night after night, he prayed, washed the boy's chest with warm water, and burned herbs to clear the air. Days passed. The boy lived. Word spread through the villages that St. Havel's monks could cure the cursed. Peasants came in droves, offering bread and candles as thanks. But Eamon knew better. He was not curing disease. He was calming it, slowing it, helping the body fight what it barely understood. Still, he smiled when he saw the boy running again in the courtyard. Sometimes he whispered to Brother Lucien, "Faith alone cannot save, but faith gives us the courage to try." The monks recorded every remedy in their illuminated manuscripts. Gold ink lined the pages with the names of herbs: salvia, mentha, rosmarinus. The scriptorium smelled of parchment and crushed petals. Each book was a treasure, guarded as fiercely as holy relics. These manuscripts would one day form the roots of medieval medicine, the link between ancient wisdom and the future of science. But not all who healed were welcomed. Beyond the monastery walls, women who practiced the same arts were called witches. The same hands that grew herbs for monks could be burned at the stake if they belonged to a peasant woman. Faith protected some, fear condemned others. Brother Eamon often thought of Elwyn, a healer he once met years ago in a village far south. He wondered if she still lived, or if fire had claimed her like so many others accused of witchcraft. As years passed, Eamon grew frail. His hands shook as he mixed herbs, but his eyes remained bright. He believed the world was changing, that one day healing would no longer belong to faith alone. God, he wrote in his final entry, does not hide truth to keep it from us. He hides it so we may learn to seek it. He died on a cold morning, his journal open beside him, ink still wet from his last prayer. The younger monks continued his work. They copied his notes, shared his mixtures, and began to experiment with new herbs, new methods, new courage. Slowly, the monasteries became the beating heart of medieval healing, part chapel, part laboratory, where hope was brewed in clay jars and whispered through stone holes. Outside, the world remained cruel. Plagues would come again, and many would die believing disease was a curse. But within those quiet walls, seeds of truth had been planted, seeds that would grow into the future of medicine. And as the sun set over St. Havel, Brother Lucian closed Eamon's journal, whispered a prayer, and carried the torch forward. Faith had been their light, but soon knowledge would burn just as bright. The great cities had their monasteries, but in the wild places between, in the fog-covered valleys, along the banks of forgotten rivers, healing belonged to the people. There were no monks here, no libraries of sacred texts, only forests, superstition, and women who spoke to the wind. These were the village healers, midwives, and wise folk, feared by priests, trusted by peasants. When the night grew thick with fever and death walked in silence, it was their door people knocked upon. In a small village near the edge of an ancient wood lived one such woman, Elswith. Her cottage smelled of smoke, nettle, and drying herbs that hung from every beam. To the villagers, she was both blessing and curse. Some called her Mother of Earth. Others whispered witch. Yet when sickness came, even the most fearful found their way to her door. She did not pray in Latin or wear robes. Her prayers were in the language of soil and rain. Elswith had learned her craft from her grandmother, who had learned it from hers. She knew where the hemlock grew deadly and where the yarrow grew healing. She knew when the moon's pull made herbs strongest, and how to mix roots with honey to draw poison from the blood. Her eyes saw things most ignored, how ants avoided certain plants, how wounded wolves licked moss from a tree, how the sickest flowers leaned toward the sun before dying. One morning, a mother came to her, carrying a child burning with fever. The boy's breath rattled, his skin hot as coals. The priest says it's punishment, the mother cried. Elswith touched the child's brow and shook her head. No, she said softly, it's the summer fever. The body fights what it cannot name. She boiled water, crushed willow bark, and poured the mixture between the child's lips. The mother crossed herself, whispering that only God could heal. Elswith did not argue. Then may God bless the bark of his trees, she murmured. For days she tended the boy, cooling him with wet cloths, burning sage to drive out bad air, whispering to the spirits of health to stay near. On the 5th day, the fever broke. The child awoke hungry. The mother wept, calling it a miracle. Elswith only smiled and gathered her herbs again. Her fame spread quietly from village to village. She treated toothaches with cloves, bleeding with nettle tea, childbirth pain with lavender oil. Her remedies were a mixture of wisdom, luck, and faith, and though she lacked formal learning, her hands saved more lives than many noble physicians. Still, danger always lingered. Churchmen frowned upon those who healed without the blessing of Scripture. To them, a woman who spoke of spirits and mixed herbs at midnight was consorting with the devil. Once, A traveller fell ill near the village, a wealthy merchant, pale and delirious from infection. Elswith took him in, cleaned his wounds with vinegar and wrapped them in moss. When he recovered, he thanked her with silver coins and tales of faraway lands. But word of the miracle spread too far. Within weeks, the local priest came knocking, armed with a Bible and suspicion. "You cure without prayer," he said. "You call on spirits." Elswith met his gaze calmly. "I call on the earth God made," she answered. "If that is sin, then we are all born sinners." Her defiance stirred fear. That night, the villagers debated outside her cottage. Some said she saved their children, others said she cursed their cows. Firelight flickered on their faces, their voices heavy with both gratitude and dread. But when winter returned and sickness came again, they knocked once more, because even fear bows to survival. Elswith's remedies came from everywhere, from the roots that smelled of damp soil, from stones heated by fire, from honey that never spoiled. She treated stomach pain with mint, wounds with ash and fat, coughs with steam from boiled pine. Her most secret cure was something few understood: rest. The body must be quiet. She told her patients, even the earth sleeps before spring. At night, when the moon hung low, she wrote her knowledge on scraps of bark, fearing that one day no one would remember. "They burn our kind," she whispered to the dark, "but the sickness will not stop burning us." She hid her notes beneath the floorboards among jars of dried roots and bones. Once, a plague struck her village, swift, merciless, invisible. Men died in their beds before sunrise. The priest prayed, the people wailed. But Elswith did not stop working. She burned pitch in every house, forced the sick to stay apart, washed the linens in boiling water. Many called her mad, until they noticed her patients dying less than others. Her understanding of isolation, though born from instinct, was centuries ahead of its time. One evening, as the last plague victim was buried, the priest came again, but this time he bowed. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "your hands are guided by something holy after all." Elswith did not answer. She only looked toward the forest, where mist curled through the trees like a breath of old gods. "Perhaps," she whispered, "holiness has many faces with each passing season." The healers like her kept the forgotten knowledge alive in caves, in cottages, in hidden books written by candlelight. They healed with leaves, fire, and intuition, while scholars argued about humors and sins. These were the silent guardians of the people, nameless in history, but vital to survival. Years later, when Elswith's hair turned white and her hands trembled, she passed her jars and herbs to a young girl named Miruan. "Never fear the sickness," she told her. "Fear only ignorance." The girl nodded, her eyes wide with wonder. Outside, thunder rolled and rain began to fall, washing the village roofs, feeding the herbs that would heal another generation. Elswith's grave was simple, a stone carved with a single word: Herba. The villagers still left flowers there, whispering prayers mixed with gratitude and guilt. Though they never called her saint, her spirit lingered in every healing root. Every mother's prayer, every village breath drawn after fever faded, and thus the story of the village healers endured, the unseen physicians of the medieval world, who fought disease not with tools or titles, but with courage, compassion, and the wisdom of the earth itself. It began quietly, a cough, a fever, a swelling beneath the arm. No one knew what it was, and no one wanted to believe what it would become. By the time the first bell tolled for the dead, it was already too late. The year was 1347, and death had come to Europe riding on rats, carried by fleas unseen and unstoppable. They would later call it the Great Mortality, the Black Death. But to those who lived it, there was no name, only terror. In a small coastal town, ships arrived from the east. Their sails were torn, their decks silent. When dock workers climbed aboard, they found the sailors dead, black sores upon their skin, eyes glazed open. The townsfolk burned the ships, but the rats had already run ashore. Within weeks, the markets emptied, the churches filled, and the air grew thick with the smell of death. The priests said it was God's wrath. The healers said it was foul air. The people said nothing, because fear had stolen their voices. Families locked themselves indoors, abandoning neighbors to their fate. Bells rang day and night as carts creaked through the streets, piled with bodies. "Bring out your dead," the collector shouted, faces wrapped in cloth soaked with vinegar. In the villages, healers like Ellsworth's apprentices fought to save what they could. Miruan, now grown, and carrying her mentor's book of herbs, travelled from house to house with bundles of garlic and sage. She burned them in every room, hoping to cleanse the air. She rubbed vinegar on the skin, washed hands with wine, and begged people to stay apart. Some listened. Most didn't. Faith was stronger than reason. They gathered in churches, praying shoulder to shoulder, spreading the sickness with every breath. Soon, even the priests fell ill. The monasteries that once sang hymns of healing became graveyards of silence. Brother Lucian, the monk who had inherited Brother Eamon's teachings, watched his brothers die one by one. He prayed, he bled himself, he burned herbs, but nothing stopped the pestilence still. He wrote everything, each symptom, each failed remedy, each glimmer of hope. The boils burst. Like black fruit, he recorded, the breath comes foul and short. Death follows within 3 days. His words would survive centuries, a testimony of human endurance amid despair. Desperation gave birth to madness. Flagellants marched from town to town, whipping their backs raw in penance. "We are the cause," they cried. "We have angered God." Others accused outsiders, Jews, foreigners, women, of spreading the plague through poison or sorcery. Fires burned not just for bodies, but for the innocent. The stench of smoke and fear became the scent of Europe. Yet, in the midst of chaos, a few still sought to heal. Miruan, guided by Ellsworth's teachings, learned patterns within the horror. She noticed that those who lived near rivers fared better. Perhaps the air there was cleaner. She saw that those who burned juniper and rosemary in their homes often survived longer. She began to believe that the sickness was not punishment, but something real, something alive, spreading through touch and breath in one village. She met a gravedigger named Tomas who had buried more than he could count yet remained healthy. "Why are you not dead?" she asked. He shrugged. "I wash my hands in vinegar," he said simply. It was a small detail, one that would echo centuries later in the science of disinfection. But in those days, such logic was dangerous. When Miruan tried to teach others to separate the sick from the healthy, she was accused of cruelty. "How can you abandon the dying?" they cried. "You speak like one without faith." She answered softly, "It is not faith I lack, it is time." Her heart broke as she turned away from those who would not listen. Whole towns vanished. Fields went unharvested. Wolves roamed the roads where merchants once travelled. Cities like Florence and London became ghostly, their air thick with ash, their bells tolling endlessly. The world seemed to end beneath a sun dimmed by grief. And yet, even as death reigned, sparks of wisdom survived. Some physicians began to wear strange long-nosed masks filled with herbs and vinegar, the first crude attempt at protection. They called them plague doctors, though few were doctors at all. Behind those beaked masks, men like Lucian's pupils continued to observe, record, and question. They began to suspect that the sickness spread from person to person, a thought both revolutionary and terrifying. Miruan, too, carried on her work. She walked through deserted streets, clutching a pouch of herbs and a wooden cross. One evening, she found a child crying beside two lifeless bodies, his parents. She knelt, gave him water, and carried him to an abandoned cottage. For days she nursed him, feeding him garlic broth and keeping him clean. The boy survived. For the first time in months, she wept with joy. "If one can live," she whispered, "then the world can still heal." When at last the plague began to fade, as mysteriously as it had arrived, Europe awoke to a changed world. Villages were gone, fields empty, and churches quieter. But knowledge had grown like a seed beneath ash. People began to question old beliefs. They started washing, cleaning, boiling, isolating, not because priests commanded it, but because experience had taught them. Miruan buried her herbs beneath the roots of an oak and whispered a promise, "One day, someone will understand what we did not." She left her mentor's book inside a monastery library before vanishing into the forest. Her name forgotten, her work not, centuries later. Historians would say that the Black Death killed half of Europe, but it also cured its ignorance. It forced the world to see disease not as punishment, but as nature, It pushed medicine toward observation, sanitation, and reason, and so through the fire and faith of those who dared to face the invisible enemy, the first step toward modern healing began, not in laboratories, but in fear in ashes and in the courage of the few who refused to stop trying. By the time the plague's shadow began to fade, the world stood on uneasy legs, wounded, wiser, and questioning. The old certainties of faith had been shaken, and whispers of reason began to stir like spring beneath frozen soil. But in the century that followed, medicine still walked in darkness, guided not by microscopes or germs, but by the invisible rivers of the body called humours. In every castle, in every city, the learned physicians swore by it, that life itself flowed from the sacred fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. To them, health was harmony, illness was imbalance. If one humour overpowered the rest, madness, fever, or melancholy would follow. And so, the physician's task was not to cure, it was to restore balance by any means necessary. In the University of Paris, a physician named Master Roland taught his students beside a candlelit skeleton. The air reeked of ink, dust, and oil. "You must remember," he said, tapping the parchment where coloured circles represented the humours, "man is the reflection of the cosmos. Fire, earth, water, and air dwell within his veins. When they quarrel, the body falls ill." He believed in the wisdom of Galen, the ancient Greek healer whose writings had survived for over 1,000 years. Galen's words were law, no monk, no scholar dared contradict them. And yet, as Roland's students peered at his diagrams, a few began to wonder if these invisible fluids were truly there, or merely shadows of understanding. Still, the treatments continued. Bloodletting was the most sacred of them all. If fever burned, it was said the blood was too hot and must be drained. Patients were bled with silver knives or with leeches, pale, wriggling creatures prized by nobles and peasants alike. To see blood flow was to see the sickness leave the body. The weaker the patient became, the more certain the physician felt that the humours were in balance again. In the town of York, a young woman named Agnes watched her father collapse after a physician's visit. He had been bled for a cough that never healed. The man who called himself a doctor took his coins and left with the calm of certainty. Agnes, her hands shaking, whispered to her dying father, "They say it is balance, but I think it is death." She pressed cloths to his wounds and prayed, not to God this time, but to the earth beneath her. Agnes would become one of the quiet rebels, the observers who began to question whether bleeding and purging truly healed anyone. She kept a journal, noting what she saw, the patients who survived when left untouched, and those who perished after too much treatment. She dared to write what few others would, that perhaps illness was not the body's enemy, but its signal. The fever, she wrote, is not the fire that destroys, but the fire that defends. But the world was not yet ready for such heresy. Physicians clung to their humours like priests to scripture. They prescribed purges of bitter herbs to cleanse the stomach, ordered hot baths to balance the cold humours, and forced patients to vomit in hopes of harmony. They studied astrology, believing the stars themselves governed health. A patient's cure might depend not on symptoms, but on the position of Mars and Jupiter. Even kings obeyed such counsel. When the English monarch Henry VI fell ill, his royal physicians examined the heavens before his pulse. They declared his malady a disturbance of melancholy bile caused by Saturn's shadow, and ordered leeches placed upon his temple. The king survived by luck, not science, and the physicians claimed victory. Yet, cracks began to form in the wall of tradition. Across the Mediterranean, scholars in Islamic lands had preserved and expanded the works of ancient medicine. They studied anatomy through dissection, mapped veins and nerves, and tested herbs in hospitals centuries before Europe dared to open a body. Their books, written in Arabic and Persian, began to reach European universities through translation. One of these works, Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, became a revelation. It spoke of observation, of cause and effect, of the physician's duty to test, not assume. Young scholars like Agnes, reading in secret, began to copy these ideas. In taverns and candlelit corners, they whispered about balance giving way to biology. If the blood flows from the heart, one asked, then what stirs it? Another replied, not humours, but something living, perhaps life itself still. Superstition lingered. patients continued to carry amulets, drink crushed gemstones, and recite prayers before swallowing herbs. The blending of faith and medicine persisted, part science, part ceremony. In one monastery, Brother Matthias would bless every bowl of medicine before giving it, believing the holy word made it stronger. Let faith and herb work as one, he said. In the countryside, however, healers like Miron's descendants still worked in secret. They mixed garlic with honey for wounds, used willow bark for pain, and burned sulfur to cleanse the air, all remedies that truly worked, though none of them knew. Why? When the noble physicians failed, villagers often returned to these simple cures, muttering that perhaps the earth was wiser than the universities. One evening, Agnes treated a feverish child. By bathing him in cool water and feeding him broth, when he recovered, she wrote, "No bleeding, no bile, no stars, only rest." Her small act of defiance would one day echo across generations, proof that sometimes healing came not from ancient doctrine, but from compassion and common sense. As years turned to decades, the belief in humors began to weaken. More scholars began to look with their eyes, not their faith. They dissected animals, drew detailed sketches of muscles and bones, and began to see the body as a structure of parts, not a vessel of spirits. Slowly, painfully, the truth began to surface. The blood was not to be drained but understood. Yet the humors did not die easily. Even as the Renaissance dawned, physicians still clung to them like ghosts that refused to leave the body of knowledge. The world stood on the edge of discovery, staring into the unknown, afraid to let go of what had guided it for centuries. And in the quiet corners of history, in forgotten notebooks, hidden manuscripts, and the whispered doubts of healers like Agnes, the next revolution in medicine was already being born. A world that had bled for balance was beginning to search for truth. For the first time, humanity's greatest cure would not come from prayer or punishment, but from the courage to question. By the late Middle Ages, as kingdoms rose and wars raged across Europe, the world of healing began to change again, this time not in monasteries or candlelit studies, but on blood-soaked battlefields. The plague had passed, the humors still ruled, yet war demanded something no prayer or herb alone could provide. Hands unafraid to cut. Thus emerged a new kind of healer, the surgeon. They were not noble physicians with ink-stained fingers and Latin tongues. They were craftsmen, barbers, blacksmiths, and butchers who learned the body by necessity, not scripture. The battlefield was their classroom, pain their teacher, and courage their only shield. They worked with knives, saws, and fire, often in the open air, surrounded by screams and chaos. Among these men was one who would be remembered not for titles, but for his heart, Guillaume de Vienne, a humble barber surgeon who followed armies from France to Flanders. He owned a chest of crude tools, iron forceps, sewing needles, and a small brazier to heat his blade. His patients were soldiers, men torn by arrows, crushed by maces, burned by fire. When others ran from blood, Guillaume stepped forward. "Courage," he would whisper, pressing his hand on a soldier's trembling arm. "You live because we try." His methods were brutal. There was no anesthesia, no understanding of infection. Yet his touch carried something rare, compassion. He cleaned wounds with wine. Not knowing it killed some germs, he tied bleeding veins, not knowing he was glimpsing the future of surgery. In those days, surgeons were looked down upon. Physicians studied in universities, writing theories of humors, while surgeons worked in taverns and tents, dismissed as laborers. A man who cuts, they said, is no scholar. But when knights returned from battle, it was not the scholars who saved them. It was the cutters, the barbers, the men like Guillaume. One night, after a brutal siege, Guillaume was called to tend to a noble knight impaled by a spear. The wound festered, stinking of death. The court physician declared him doomed, muttering about imbalanced humors. But Guillaume refused to surrender. He heated his knife red-hot in the fire and prayed softly before cutting. The stench of burnt flesh filled the air. The knight screamed, yet he lived. Weeks later, when he walked again, the same physician bowed before Guillaume and whispered, "Perhaps your steel holds more mercy than my books." Word of Guillaume's skill spread. He began teaching young apprentices, showing them how to wash wounds, how to stitch flesh, how to use wine to cleanse. "Do not fear blood. He told them, "Fear ignorance. The body speaks. You must learn its language." His teachings were simple, but they carried a truth deeper than any theory of humors. Meanwhile, in monasteries and cities, others began to follow the same path. A new generation of healers, scholars, and surgeons alike started to question the divide between mind and hand. One of them, a young Italian named Theodoric of Lucca, wrote boldly, "It is not blood that kills, but the rot that follows." He began boiling instruments, cleaning wounds, even stitching with silk thread instead of leaving them open. Too many. His words were madness. To history, they were the dawn of sterile surgery. On battlefields, experiments born of desperation saved lives. Some surgeons discovered that boiling oil, once used to cauterize wounds, killed more men than it cured. Guillaume, upon seeing soldiers die in agony from such treatment, tried something new. He used clean cloth and ointment of rose oil and turpentine instead. The next morning, he found his patients alive, calmer, healing faster. The body needs peace. He wrote in his notes, not torture. His discoveries would later echo through time, influencing great minds like Ambroise Père, who would famously declare, "I dressed him, God healed him." But for now, Guillaume's words were carried only by apprentices who remembered his kindness more than his technique. The life of a surgeon was not glorious. They lived close to death, their hands scarred, their clothes stained with blood. They worked in dim light, with cries of agony their only chorus, but through their crude work, they learned truths no scholar could find in parchment. They saw that wounds healed faster when clean, that broken bones could mend if set true, that the body itself fought to live if given the chance. In the cities, guilds of barber surgeons began to form, strange brotherhoods of men who shaved beards by day and saved lives by night. They learned anatomy by observing executions, sketching bones and muscles in secret. Some smuggled corpses from graveyards just to study them, risking prison for the sake of knowledge. To understand life, they said, one must walk through death. Guillaume grew old before his time, his hands stiff from years of holding blades. Yet he never sought fame. One winter, after saving a child from a deep wound, he sat by the fire and murmured, perhaps one day, "They will not call us butchers." He looked at his tools, the knife, the thread, the needle, and smiled faintly. "These are not weapons," he whispered. "These are hope made of steel." When he died, his apprentices buried him on a hill overlooking a river, placing his knife beside him as a symbol. On his grave, they carved his favorite words, "He cut so others might heal." Centuries later, when surgeons wore clean gloves and silver instruments gleamed in bright hospitals, they would trace their craft back to men like Guillaume, the forgotten warriors of mercy. They were the bridge between faith and science, between superstition and understanding. And though they worked with pain, surrounded by blood and screams, it was through them that medicine learned its greatest lesson, that healing sometimes begins with a wound. As the Middle Ages crept toward the edge of the Renaissance, when faith began to blur with curiosity, a new breed of healer emerged. Neither priest nor surgeon, but something far more mysterious. They called themselves alchemists. To the church, they were half heretics to kings. They were half miracle workers. But to themselves, they were seekers of truth, explorers of both matter and spirit, chasing the dream that no illness could touch, the elixir of life. These men and women labored in secret chambers, deep beneath castles and monasteries. By candlelight, they mixed mercury with sulfur, burned lead until it smoked, and whispered prayers to both God and the stars. Their chambers smelled of brimstone and herbs, their walls lined with flasks, crucibles, and symbols that few could read. To the world, they were mad, to themselves enlightened. Among them was an English scholar named Edric of Canterbury, once a monk, later cast out for daring to claim that healing came not from prayer alone, but from transformation of both metal and soul. He believed that just as lead could be turned into gold, sickness could be turned into strength. The body, he wrote, is but a vessel of base metal. The wise may refine it. Every night, Edric worked beside a roaring fire, studying ancient manuscripts, the works of Hermes Trismegistus, of Avicenna and Paracelsus. He filled his journal with strange diagrams, the human body drawn as a furnace, the soul as fire. illness as corruption. He believed that within every herb, every mineral, there was a spark of divine perfection, the same spark that could mend both flesh and spirit. In his experiments, Edric brewed potions that shimmered like liquid gold. Some cured fevers, others nearly killed their drinkers. He used wine to draw out the essence of plants, crushed gems into powder, and distilled rainwater during lunar eclipses, believing it held celestial energy. The heavens heal what the earth wounds. He often murmured. People whispered of his miracles. A dying noble's son, pale and coughing blood, was brought to him. Edric gave him a draught of silver and rosemary, then placed a charm of copper over his heart. Within days, the boy began to recover. It is not the charm, Edric said softly. It is the belief that binds body and soul. Word spread that he had touched the secret of immortality. But the church watched him closely. Healing was to be done through faith, not flame. When questioned, Edric spoke gently. If God placed gold in the earth, did he not wish us to find it? If he had knowledge in the stars, did he not wish us to seek it? The bishops frowned. Curiosity, in their eyes, was the first sin. Still, alchemy thrived. Across Europe, others like Edric pursued the same dream. In Prague, alchemists burned through fortunes seeking the philosopher's stone, said to turn any illness into vitality, any metal into gold. In Spain, Jewish and Arabic scholars shared secret formulas for longevity, blending science and mysticism. In Italy, a woman known only as Isabella the White Flame claimed to have found the water of eternal youth, but she vanished before revealing it, her notes burned in her own laboratory fire. For many, alchemy was not about wealth or eternal life, it was about balance. They believed the universe mirrored the human body, that when stars aligned wrongly, fevers raged. When metals were impure, blood turned black. To heal, one had to restore harmony between all things. And so they studied astrology, philosophy, and the hidden properties of nature, blending them into a single art. Edric grew old in his secret tower, still searching. He never found the elixir, but he discovered something else, that some potions healed wounds faster, some eased pain, some purified infected flesh. Without meaning to, he began to create primitive chemical medicine. He boiled herbs with minerals, testing each batch on stray dogs and on himself. He coughed blood for weeks, then recovered, whispering, knowledge demands sacrifice. One winter, as snow buried his town, a plague swept through Canterbury. The physicians prayed. The surgeons fled, but Edric stayed. He burned juniper and sulphur to cleanse the air, poured vinegar over doorways, and brewed bitter tonics of wormwood and garlic. Many survived who came to him. When asked if he had found the elixir at last, he smiled weakly. No. But perhaps the elixir is not one drink. Perhaps it is understanding. Years later, when he died alone, his tower was raided by frightened villagers. They found flasks glowing faintly in the dark, books filled with Latin symbols, and a letter addressed to no one. If one day men heal not with faith alone, but with reason and love together, then know that the stone has been found, not in gold, but in the human heart. The church burned his papers, calling them sorcery. Yet some fragments survived, carried secretly by apprentices, copied in hidden ink, passed down through centuries. In those words lay the seeds of chemistry, the science that would one day replace alchemy, and a whisper of a truth the Middle Ages could not yet grasp, that healing was not only divine, but also deeply human, that the body was not a mystery to fear, but a puzzle to solve, and that even in the darkness of ignorance, the flame of curiosity could illuminate the path toward medicine. And though the alchemists never found immortality, their quest left behind something far greater, the courage to question, and a dream that perhaps, through understanding, humankind could one day conquer not just disease, but death itself. By the 14th century, the world was trembling between two powers, faith and reason. The church still reigned over hearts, its shadow falling across every candlelit village and stone cathedral. But somewhere, beneath that shadow, the spark of science began to glow. The old healers whispered of herbs and stars, of air that could sicken and water that could heal. And for every whisper of knowledge, there came the thunder of accusation, heresy. It was a dangerous age to think differently. To question divine will was to question God himself. Illness, the priest said, was a punishment for sin. To heal without confession was to defy heaven. Yet across Europe, brave souls began to wonder, if God had given man a mind, was it not meant to be used? In a small monastery near Florence lived Brother Matteo, a quiet friar with ink-stained fingers and eyes that burned with curiosity. While others prayed over the sick, he observed. He noticed that fevers spread not by sin, but by breath from one coughing monk to another. He wrote his thoughts in secret. The pestilence moves like wind unseen but swift. He began boiling water before drinking it, cleaning wounds with wine instead of holy oil. The sick under his care began to live. The abbot called it a miracle, Matteo called it reason. One evening, when a nobleman's son fell gravely ill, Matteo applied his strange methods, washing his hands, burning herbs to cleanse the room. The boy recovered. But when the noble's priest heard of it, he was furious. "You mock God's mercy," he thundered. "You steal his glory for your own." Matteo tried to explain. "I do not deny his hand, I seek to understand it." But in those times, understanding was the most dangerous sin of all. He was summoned before the Inquisition, accused of practicing forbidden arts. The court smelled of incense and fear. "You claim sickness is not sent by God," the bishop demanded. Matteo's voice trembled but did not falter. "God made the world in order. He gave us eyes to see that order. When I study his creation, I honor him." The court fell silent. Such words were too bold for that age. He was found guilty of pride, spared death, but banished from the monastery forever. That night, as he walked into the rain, he whispered, "If knowledge is sin, then may heaven forgive the curious." Matteo vanished into the countryside, healing the poor in secret. His remedies spread by rumor. Wine for wounds, heat for infection, smoke to purify air. The church called them heretical cures, yet they worked. Villagers whispered his name like a prayer. Brother Matteo, the healer of reason. He was not alone. Across the continent, others defied the old ways. In France, a midwife named Elisande of Rouen saved mothers and infants. With her herbal tonics and warm water baths, practices the priests condemned as pagan. She taught women to wash hands before childbirth, to boil linens, to use lavender to calm pain. Her methods saved lives, but her knowledge frightened men. One night, the Inquisition came. "You heal with the devil's herbs," they said. "You steal life meant for heaven." She was dragged to trial, her baskets of herbs laid out as evidence. She looked at the judges and said calmly, "If the devil teaches mercy, then perhaps we have misnamed him for that." She was burned, but her students escaped, carrying her recipes in hidden scraps of parchment, buried in fields, sewn into hems of clothing. Her legacy lived in whispers and roots, in the gardens of women who healed when no one else would. The clash between faith and reason grew fierce. The church forbade dissection, yet young scholars in Padua and Bologna snuck into graveyards at night, cutting open corpses by moonlight to study the body's secrets. They discovered valves in the heart, muscles in the limbs, chambers in the brain, all proof that the body was not a vessel of sin, but a masterpiece of design. Each discovery was an act of rebellion, each healing a silent defiance. Yet for every burned book and silenced scholar, the truth spread further. People began to see illness not as divine wrath, but as something earthly, something that could be understood and perhaps one day conquered. And so, faith and science did not destroy each other, they danced, clashed and collided like storm and sea. Some priests began to soften, saying, "If knowledge is from God, then to use it is worship." A few even kept herbs behind their altars, holy water beside wine-soaked bandages. Brother Matteo lived to old age, still wandering, still healing. When plague came again, he stayed while others fled. "I do not fight God," he said softly to his frightened followers. "I fight the ignorance that offends him." He died with a smile, his journal beside him, filled with drawings of herbs, notes on air and infection, and a single line scrawled in the corner, "There is no heresy in kindness." Years later, his writings would inspire thinkers of the Renaissance, the age when men would finally see that faith and knowledge could coexist, that healing need not defy heaven to serve humanity. And though the church tried to silence those voices, their echoes would rise again and again, in every scholar who dissected a body, in every healer who dared to wash their hands, in every whisper of truth carried from one century to the next. For in the war between faith and science, neither truly won, but together, through centuries of conflict, they forged the soul of medicine, a soul that believed not just in God, but in compassion, curiosity, and a courage to seek the light within the darkness. While kings paid gold for physicians and monks debated the humours of the body, the real healers of the Middle Ages worked in silence under moonlight. Far from marble halls and monasteries, they were the women and men of the villages, the cunning folk, the wise women, the herb wives and bone setters. They had no Latin, no parchment, no noble blood, only memory, instinct, and a fierce compassion for those who suffered. In the eyes of the church, they were suspicious. In the eyes of the people, they were saviors. They learned not from books, but from generations. A mother teaching her, daughter the power of nettle for blood, yarrow for wounds, thyme for coughs. An old shepherd showing his son how to set a broken bone by feel, not theory. Their knowledge passed through stories, through taste, through touch. Each village had one, a woman whose door was never locked, whose shelves were lined with dried flowers, roots, and jars filled with secrets. One such woman lived on the edge of a forest in northern England. Her name was Brida of Thornhill. Her cottage smelled of smoke, honey, and herbs. The villagers came to her with all manner of suffering, fevers, childbirth, aching joints, even despair. To each she gave something from her garden, a poultice, a brew, a prayer whispered not to saints but to the spirit of life itself. When a child fell ill, she boiled mint and willow bark. When a man's wound festered, she packed it with crushed garlic and honey. She believed the earth offered every cure if one listened long enough. Her potions did not sparkle. They steamed and hissed and carried the scent of survival. To the poor, she was Mother Brida, the hand of mercy. But to the priest, she was dangerous. She heals without confession, he warned. She cures what God has chosen to punish. Yet when his own sister lay dying of fever, it was Brida he sought in secret. One cold night, she sat beside the sick girl, laying a warm cloth soaked in vinegar on her brow. The body speaks softly, she whispered. We must learn to listen. The girl lived and the priest said nothing. Brida's remedies were part wisdom, part courage. When winter came and food was scarce, she made broth from nettles and marrow bones, saying it warms both belly and soul. When plague whispered through her village, she burned rosemary and juniper to cleanse the air. Washing hands in vinegar, acts no one understood, but all obeyed. Still, danger followed her. Word reached the nearby abbey that she spoke with spirits, that she knew too much for a woman. When the Inquisition's men arrived, they found her kneeling by a sick child, feeding him broth. By what power do you heal? They demanded. Brida looked up, her eyes calm. By love, she said. They called it witchcraft. She called it kindness. Dragged from her home, she faced judgment in the village square. The people she had healed wept silently. Confess your pact with the devil, they told her. She smiled faintly. If compassion be the devil's work, then I am guilty. She was taken away, never seen again. But the villagers buried her garden with care, marking the soil with stones shaped like hearts. They kept her recipes alive, nettle for blood, thyme for lungs, honey for wounds, whispered from one healer to another, hidden in the folds of time. Brida was not alone in her fate. Across Europe, countless wise women shared the same story, healers who knew too much, loved too deeply and paid with their lives, yet through them, medicine survived the centuries of ignorance. In France, Laumire-Jean treated burns with pig fat and beeswax, unknowingly inventing a primitive bomb. In Ireland, Sean the bone binder used wet cloths to splint arms and legs, his methods centuries ahead of their time. In Germany, Elsbeth Kruterfrau brewed beer with herbs to fight infection in wounds. These nameless heroes, scorned by the educated, held the world together when plague and war tore it apart. Their medicine came not from laboratories, but from the soil beneath their feet and the tenderness of their hearts. And though they lacked the language of science, they understood something even greater, that healing was not only a cure, but an act of love. They sat with the dying, listened to the grieving, comforted the broken. In a world ruled by fear, They were the quiet defiance of hope. As centuries turned, scholars would rediscover their wisdom and call it botany, pharmacology, anatomy. But the roots of those sciences grew from the gardens of the common folk, from the wild flowers gathered under moonlight, from the whispered prayers over boiling pots, from the soft hands of those who believed no soul should suffer alone. In the end, the world forgot their names but remembered their touch. The physicians of the Renaissance would write books and kings would build hospitals, but somewhere, deep in the countryside, a cottage window would still glow faintly at midnight, and inside an old woman would still stir a pot, humming to herself, keeping alive the oldest kind of medicine, faith in the power to heal. The dawn of the Renaissance rose like a new sun over the ashes of the Middle Ages. After centuries of darkness, plague, and superstition, Europe began to stir, cities hummed with art, invention, and inquiry. Painters studied light as healers began to study flesh. The human body, once a forbidden mystery, became a map of divine design, to be drawn, measured, and finally understood. In Florence, Venice, and Padua, the old world of monks and myths gave way to men of daring thought. They no longer whispered their questions, they declared them aloud. The church's grasp loosened, libraries opened, and the air filled with the electric hum of curiosity. It was a time when one could look at her, wound and see not sin but science. Among the many who shaped this awakening stood Andreas Vesalius, a young physician from Brussels. At a time when doctors still worshipped the ancient words of Galen, Vesalius did the unthinkable. He doubted them. The truth of the body, he wrote, is not found in books, but beneath the skin. He entered the cold chambers where the dead lay and did what had once been a crime. He cut. By torchlight, he opened the human body not with reverence, but with wonder. Muscles, bones, veins, nerves, all revealed themselves as the language of life. This, he whispered, is God's handwriting. His masterpiece, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, shocked the world. Filled with meticulous drawings, veins coiled like rivers, muscles sculpted like marble, it was the first true map of the human form. It shattered 1,000 years of error and set fire to ignorance. Some priests called it blasphemy. Others saw it as devotion through discovery. For the first time, faith and knowledge began to walk side by side. Across Europe, universities became the new cathedrals of learning. In Padua, students gathered in anatomy theatres, watching dissections like sacred rituals. In Bologna, scholars studied the pulse, the breath, and the beating heart. The body was no longer the enemy of the soul. It was its reflection. New tools appeared, glass lenses that magnified the unseen, scales that measured the delicate balance of mixtures, and presses that spread knowledge faster than fear could silence it. Books once chained to monastery walls now travelled from city to city, carrying drawings of the body, lists of herbs and treatises on disease. And with these books came new names, Paracelsus, who declared that disease came not from demons but from poisons in the body. He threw away the theories of humours and replaced them with chemistry, saying, "The dose makes the poison." To some, he was a madman, to others, a prophet. He burned old medical texts in the streets, shouting, "We must heal the sick, not the superstition." He travelled from village to village, healing with mercury, sulphur, and salts, crude but revolutionary. Nature is the physician, he told his students. Man is only the servant. And though his experiments sometimes failed, his ideas ignited a new fire. That medicine was not prayer or punishment, but knowledge applied with purpose. Artists became healers of the body's image. Leonardo da Vinci dissected corpses in secret, sketching every tendon and bone with divine precision. His notebooks showed hearts like engines, lungs like bellows, and embryos curled in the womb. Proof that art and science were one. To know the body, he wrote, is to know the soul. It was a rebirth of vision where beauty met biology, and every discovery peeled back another layer of mystery. The human body, once feared, was now celebrated, painted, studied, and revered as the greatest creation of all. Hospitals began to change as well. Once dark places of waiting for death, they became spaces of care and learning. Monks and physicians worked side by side, recording symptoms, testing remedies, and seeking causes. Surgery evolved from guesswork to precision, and anatomy became the foundation of all healing. Yet even in this age of light, shadows remained. Superstition still lingered among the poor, and the plague still haunted cities. But now, for the first time, humanity had the tools and the will to fight back. In one small Florentine hospital, a young healer named Lucia di Rossi tended to the sick with both faith and reason. She prayed as she washed her hands, mixed herbs with measured care, and spoke gently to her patients. "The Lord gives us wisdom," she said. "To use it is our praise." She represented a new kind of healer, not bound by fear, but guided by both devotion and discovery. The Renaissance was not just a rebirth of art, it was a rebirth of compassion. Healing was no longer seen as divine punishment or forbidden magic. It became a noble science, a bridge between heaven and earth. The physician was no longer a servant of mystery, but a student of truth, and so the age of superstition began to crumble. From the ashes of the medieval world rose a new understanding that the body could be studied, the mind enlightened, and disease defeated not by miracles alone, but by the marriage of knowledge and kindness. Vesalius's drawings spread across Europe. Paracelsus's ideas took root. Leonardo's sketches slept quietly in hidden notebooks, waiting for the world to catch up. But together, they whispered the same message, that the human form, in all its complexity, was not to be feared but cherished. And thus, after centuries of darkness, the light of medicine was reborn, not in the glow of candles, but in the minds of those who dared to see. The candlelight of the Middle Ages has long since faded, but its glow still lingers, faint, flickering, eternal. From the smoky huts of peasants to the stone infirmaries of monasteries, the story of medieval healing is not one of ignorance alone, but of resilience. Humanity, lost in shadow, still searched for the light, and it was this searching, this stubborn refusal to surrender to disease, that shaped the roots of modern medicine. The healers of that world, wrapped in wool and faith, worked without instruments, microscopes or sterilization. Yet they had something powerful, belief that wounds could close, that fevers could break, and that suffering had meaning. They didn't heal with knowledge, but with hope, and hope, in every century, is medicine's first ingredient. As the centuries turned, the superstitions that once guided their hands became stepping stones for the science that followed. What the medieval mind called humours, we now call systems. What they called evil spirits, we call infection. Their herbs became the ancestors of our medicines, their poultices the grandfathers of our bandages. Even their errors taught lessons, sometimes painfully, but always with purpose. From the monks who copied medical scrolls by candlelight, preserving ancient wisdom from being lost to war and time, to the herbal women of the countryside who gathered plants by moonlight, whispering cures that science would one day validate, their legacy runs in the veins of every doctor today. They did not know of cells, bacteria, or blood types, yet they kept humanity alive through centuries when death was always at the door. The story of their struggle is written in sweat and scripture, in whispered prayers and desperate hands. When plagues came, they did not run, they stayed beside the dying, risking their own breath for the chance of another's. Many fell, nameless, buried without marker. Yet their courage was the foundation of every hospital that stands now. And when the Renaissance burst forth with knowledge and discovery, it did not erase the past. It built upon it. The herbal scrolls, the charms, the prayers, the primitive surgeries, all became threads in the fabric of progress. The alchemists, in their smoky labs, chasing gold, found instead the early chemistry of cures. The astrologers, charting stars, stumbled upon the rhythms of the human pulse. Even the superstitions of peasants hid fragments of truth, garlic's power, honey's healing, willow bark's pain relief. The world that once treated disease with faith alone had given birth to something greater, faith. In discovery, humanity learned that to heal was to understand, to ask questions, to experiment, to fail and try again. The tools grew sharper, the knowledge deeper, and slowly the body became less a mystery and more a masterpiece to be studied and preserved. In the quiet corridors of medieval monasteries, you can still feel it, the echo of those who first tried to bring comfort to the sick. The faint scent of herbs, the distant chant of prayer, the touch of a healer's hand on a burning brow. It was crude, yes, but it was human. and that humanity became the soul of medicine. Now, centuries later, our hospitals gleam with steel and technology. Machines breathe for us. Lasers cut with light. Antibiotics chase away death in hours. Yet at the core of all that brilliance remains the same ancient truth. Healing is both science and spirit. A doctor's oath still echoes the compassion of monks. A nurse's touch still carries the gentleness of a medieval midwife. The roots of our progress grow deep into that soil. The world that once trembled beneath the fear of disease has learned to fight it, but it has also learned to remember. Every cure discovered is a chapter written upon the bones of the past. Every medicine born from the earth honors those who once knelt in the dirt, mixing roots and prayers. We owe them more than we know, for even in their ignorance, they sought wisdom. Even in their fear, they showed courage, and even in their failures, they planted the seeds of healing that would one day flourish across the world. If you listen closely, across the centuries, you can still hear their whispers. The monks chanting in stone halls, the healers calling across fields, the dying murmuring their final prayers for deliverance, and then the silence not of defeat but of peace. The story of how medieval people treated disease without medicine is not a tale of darkness alone. It is the story of a species learning to fight, to care, to hope, without knowing why. It is the bridge between magic and science, between prayer and proof, between the trembling of faith and the certainty of knowledge. In their candles, we see our screens. In their herbs, our formulas. In their whispered prayers, our promises to save lives. Time changes the tools, but not the purpose. For the heart of healing, the will to ease pain, to understand the body and to cherish life, was born long before microscopes or machines. It was born in the medieval healer's trembling hand, lit by candlelight, guided by compassion. And so, the tale ends where it began, not in darkness, but in the fragile glow of a single flame, the flame of curiosity, the flame of care, the flame that still burns in every hospital, every home, and every healer's heart. That is their true legacy, the legacy of the forgotten healers, the bridge between shadows and dawn.